I am Kathleen White. I'm Senior Fellow and Director of the Armstrong Center for Energy and Environment at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. I'm going to give very, very, very brief remarks and even brief introductions because I feel so privileged to have the panel that we have here that I have met in actually the recent years, who have started an effort I think is critically important to communicating at the highest level to policymakers and to the public of some of the most fundamental facts about carbon dioxide and the physics of the atmosphere that surrounds our Earth. Just why I got so drawn into this. My 6 years as chairman of TCEQ, I pretty much maybe 60–70% of every day was dealing with what I was obligated to do, which was implementing federal rules under the Federal Clean Air Act, executed by EPA. When EPA in 2009 used their legal authority to declare carbon dioxide a pollutant under the Clean Air Act, which means all of this very elaborate federal laws structure applied to CO2, I was flabbergasted. And what many predicted would happen if that ever occurred is an inglorious mess, one man called. It's unbelievable. To call CO2 dirty pollution rather than the gas of life, to call carbon, this would be Secretary of State Kerry's most frequent comment, that it is among the worst weapons of mass destruction. If you open up a dictionary that you can buy at 7-Eleven, usually the first definition of carbon is the chemical basis of all life. The staggering spread between those two perspectives must be addressed. I was also struck that EPA doesn't imagine there's any benefits from carbon dioxide, whether man-made emissions or natural. Just unfathoming. A group of what I consider some of the most preeminent minds in science and in other areas on this issue are here before you and have taken it upon themselves to create an organization and to be ambassadors, if you will, with scientific credentials a mile long on trying to set the world right about CO2. I'm going to give you very brief introductions of them because we have little time, and I want them to have a chance to speak, but I really encourage you to, in the program you have, to look through their resumes because they're, if I actually communicate all their awards and recognitions for various kinds of scientific achievement, the panel would be large. The time allotted for the panel would be almost gone. I'm going to introduce Dr. William Happer, who is a professor emeritus in the Department of Physics at Princeton University. A very long, highly regarded, highly awarded academic career. He was also appointed by George H.W. Bush to be the Director of Energy Research at the Department of Energy. A fascinating and very, very wide-reaching purview. He's published over 200 peer-reviewed scientific papers and is a member of every the American Association for Advancement of Science, National Academy of Science, and there's not a laundry list, the highest level of recognition in our country in his field. Also is Dr. Richard Lindzen, and his bio calls him a dynamical meteorologist. His work, I think, has taken him very, very close, perhaps some of the closest to the so-called official science that has driven the political issue, more or less, from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Like Dr. Happer, Dr. Lindzen's lists of awards and recognition in the preeminent scientific societies is very impressive. And Dr. Patrick Moore is somewhat of a maverick, might I use that word? He is a co-founder and was in the leadership of Greenpeace for quite a few years. And I meant to bring a copy of it, fascinating book called Confessions of a Greenpeace Dropout. Um, and you really should read it. But he also holds a PhD, very, very active in a lot of consulting rules on environmental science, is founded an organization about, I always forget the name of the rice, Patrick, it's the golden rice, right?
Oh, golden rice now.
Golden rice now, a kind of rice that could tremendously expand the supply of feed grains on which a majority of human beings in this world depend. So without further comment, I am very, very privileged to have you all here, and I'm very privileged to have been among the group that were the founding members of this. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Catherine, and thank all of you for inviting us to come and participate. I'm Will Happer, and I'm going to tell you as quickly as I can about a new organization that we've just put together in the last year called the CO2 Coalition. A number of you here are members, and if you're not, it's only because I haven't managed to recruit you yet. So we're going to have a wide net and try and get as many people as we can to join us. Well, Leighton has spoken eloquently about CO2. There's an artist's conception of a CO2 molecule. It's got a carbon atom in the middle. It's black appropriately, and 2 oxygen atoms. I'm not sure why they're red, perhaps because of red blood. And let me say a little bit about this coalition. The coalition is formed to actually defend the honor of CO2. It's sort of funny that a molecule needs that kind of defense, but it's been declared a pollutant, and nothing could be further from the truth. Here are just a few of the members. There are many others that I don't have time to, I don't have space on this slide to review, but Kathleen herself is a founding member. Harrison Schmidt, the geologist, astronaut senator from New Mexico. Leighton Stewart, who spoke earlier this morning. Dick Lindzen, who's speaking now. Roy Spencer, who is largely responsible for the University of Alabama satellite temperature measurements. Craig Itzo has done a lot of the key work with his whole family, his father, Sherwood, on benefits of CO2 to plants. Mark Mills, who's our keynote speaker. Patrick Moore speaking, and as I say, many, many others. Well, this is coal in barges on the river. And it's actually, in spite of all you read and all you hear from the mass media, it's a benefit to the world. You know, if you look at human lifetime, it correlates very well with the use of coal, you know, health. And coal, of course, what you're looking at is CO2 from ancient atmospheres, you know, hundreds of millions of years ago. What is now black coal used to be CO2 floating around in the atmosphere. And so we're simply returning CO2 to the atmosphere from which it came when we burn coal. And it's a good thing because current levels of CO2 are very, very low now, as has been mentioned. I'd like to say we're in a CO2 famine, and that's actually true. We're in very, very low levels now. So, as I say, I'm defending the reputation of CO2, the honor of CO2. As we heard this morning, observations and empirical evidence, I should have said this morning, the previous session, show that the models don't work. The models that predict lots of warming for CO2, they're simply worthless. There's something seriously wrong. The modelers haven't figured it out. They're probably afraid to figure it out for fear of what their sponsors will do to them. Secondly, the modest warming for more CO2 will clearly be beneficial. It will increase crop yields, it will increase growing seasons, but not the growing seasons isn't very much because there's not much warming. That's already clear from observation. And you talk about validation, you can already see the greening of the planet now from satellite pictures of the Earth. So this is more than a theory. The CO2 really is having a very beneficial effect on agriculture. Now, you know, if you burn fossil fuels the wrong way, you really can make pollution. So when I say CO2 is not a pollution, I really mean CO2. If you can see stuff in the air, it's not CO2 at all, as someone pointed out, Catherine pointed out. It's colorless, tasteless, you can't see anything. So when we burn coal in this country, we're very careful to put in electrostatic precipitators. In some places we scrub out sulfur. And so you don't see this kind of stuff in America. You see it in China. This is not a problem of coal. It's a problem of enforcing environmental laws or not enforcing them. The Chinese don't enforce their laws. So you don't have to put on a electrostatic precipitator if you bribe the right official. Yeah, they could fix that if they had the courage. Another point that lots of people don't realize is that each of us is just in living as we exhale our breath isn't very different from that of a power plant. If you look at the composition, our breath is about 75% nitrogen, power plants about 70%. Our breath is 15% oxygen. You don't suck all the oxygen out. That's why you can do mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. There's still some oxygen left in your breath. Power plant is a little better. They don't like to waste too much air, so only 5% oxygen in the stack. Water vapor and CO2. Power plant is a bit more CO2 than we have, but they're essentially the same gases. Those are the major gases in both cases. So to call this a pollutant is really Orwellian. You're calling something a pollutant that all of us produce. You know, where does that lead us eventually? You know, you might want to think through that. You know, there's some consequences. We've seen this picture many times. This is just to stress again, I think you can't show this enough times, that the models don't work. The spaghetti is models. The colored blue lines are what's observed. This is University of Alabama, Roy Spencer and John Christie's satellite measurements and many, many model runs. The warming predicted is much, much more than what is being observed. I should say, just to be precise here, this is the lower troposphere. This is not the surface of the Earth. But all the models predict more warming from the lower troposphere, the lower atmosphere, than on the surface itself. So if anything, this warming should be an upper bound. Okay. Well, we've all mentioned that if plants love CO2, Leighton says if they could vote, you know, they would vote for coal. He's right about that. When I show this picture in the Northeast, I always ask my audience, what is this? Nobody knows. I hope, you know, I get responses like, well, it's marijuana or something. Of course, it's soybeans. And this is, let me get back here. Sorry about that. Soybeans, okay. And this is an example, a controlled experiment. This is Sherwood IDSO, University of Arizona, with an experiment where you grow a particular variety of pine in different levels of CO2, and you can see as you increase the CO2, the growth rate goes way, way up. And this is true of all varieties of plants. Some respond better than trees respond especially well, but all do, even corn. But soybean is more responsive than corn. I mentioned satellite observations of greening. This is work by Donahue from Australia, looking at the amount of chlorophyll on the Earth over the period 1982 to 2010. And you can see most of the Earth is greening, especially the dry regions. Look at the southern Sahara. That's getting much greener, and the reason it's getting greener is not more rainfall, it's because of more CO2. And that's true of Western Australia, Western India. The dry parts of the world are benefiting from more CO2. If a plant has more CO2, it doesn't need as much water, so it can make do with less water. Uh, Let me just say a word about the consensus. I hear a lot of that in my community. How could 97% of the scientists be wrong? And the answer is that 97% of the scientists have often been wrong on many things. And let me give the sort of prime example. This is Trofim Lysenko. And I thought I saw Ari Halper, and he would remember Trofim since he's from the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union. But Trofim Lysenko was an agronomist who persuaded the power structures in the Soviet Union that that genes were a wicked myth, of the West, that acquired characteristics could be inherited and passed on. You could have spontaneous generation of life, all sorts of wacky things. But he was fully supported by the government, and I can assure you that 97% of Soviet biologists supported him, because if they didn't support him, they were either out of a job or, even worse, in a concentration, and one or two were actually executed. You guys think about that, when you come out. Okay. One thing I think that is important that we have to do is to remember to maintain unity. I like this old legend about Khan Kubrat, who actually was the founder of the Bulgarian state. But he has this bundle of sticks, and he asks his sons to break the bundle. And of course, they can't break the bundle. There are all these sticks. And then he takes the sticks out one by one and breaks them, and he's old and feeble, but he can do it. So it's important as we push back, and make no mistake, we're facing powers and principalities. This is not a small effort. We have to stick together. So the summary then is CO2 is really good. We should be promoting CO2. More CO2 will be good for the Earth. And policies to slow CO2 emissions are really based on nonsense. They're on flawed computer models that don't work. And so the reason we put together this group of people is to use the unity of lots of people, all with different connections, all with different ways to get to society, to try and spread the word that we're being led down a false path that we shouldn't go on. It's happened before. We shouldn't let it happen this time. So thank you very much. I'll stop.
Do we have the slides? Okay. Yeah. I forgot my password. Yeah, wrong one. Would you like a USB stick with it on? Okay. Okay, there it is. Well, thank you, Kathleen. It's a pleasure being here, albeit the trip was a bit long. I'm going to speak about this issue of catastrophism, because I think it's generally misrepresented, and it's certainly being misrepresented here. So be a bit of a grump on this. Does this work? Yep. Okay. Will has pointed out that the demonization of CO2 is irrational at best. CO2 itself and modest warming are almost certainly mostly beneficial. So why can one present a case against CO2? And the case is largely based on catastrophism. The notion that whatever good CO2 may do, it has the potential to destroy the planet or make it uninhabitable. Now, This is a peculiar argument, and where I differ with some of the other speakers is catastrophism does not come from the models. No model predicts these catastrophes. And where is the problem in the discourse? Well, it's a polarizing issue. And when there is a polarizing issue, we tend to take a bimodal view, for or against, skeptical, alarmist. And what I'd like to suggest is this is a false dichotomy. Global warming, I would suggest, and this is very crude, has three, not two, narratives. The narrative, the first one I would call the narrative of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Working Group 1. Remember that. That's the scientific assessment. Essentially, this is the narrative of what I regard as mostly relatively serious scientists who are supportive of government climate policies. You may not wish to give them this much credit, but let's go for a while. The second narrative I would suggest is the narrative of the so-called skeptical scientists. And the third narrative is the political environmental narrative. And these are all different. A couple of things you should understand about these narratives. The first two narratives actually have much in common. Only the third narrative is catastrophist. The third narrative is far and away the most publicized. And matters like the 97% MEM are only marginally possible if one conflates the first and third narratives and even includes the second narrative's points of agreement with the first narrative. What are the points of agreement between the first two narratives? Well, as has been mentioned, climate changes. Nobody questions that. Nobody questions that CO2 is a greenhouse gas. No one questions that added greenhouse gases should lead to some warming. Atmospheric levels of CO2 have been increasing at least since the end of the Little Ice Age. And over this period, global mean temperatures have increased slightly and irregularly. Now here's a picture I think you should keep in mind. It's a picture that appears daily in the Boston Globe. In the Boston Globe, it's presented in color. This is fine. Somehow I find it a little clearer in black and white. This is from March 12, 2013, but it doesn't matter. What the Globe does is for each day, is there a light on this or anything? Is there a laser? Yeah, I don't know.
Is there a pointer?
This won't point on these screens. The screens are unfortunately higher tech than the laser pointer.
Sorry.
Oh, shoot. What have I done now?
Just hold and I'll bring it back up, sir.
What?
I'll bring it back up, sir. Give me just a moment.
Okay.
Don't push that button.
I won't push anything. Yeah, right. Okay, let's see. Go ahead. Okay, where is it? Ah, okay. Okay, let's get back to this graph. I don't have many graphs. Okay, what they do is they take the date of the newspaper and go back 30 days. And then for each day, they show the high and low for the day. That's the dark black here. Then for each day, they show this lighter gray, which is the climatological high and low for the day. And then for each day, they have this light gray, which is the record-breaking high and low for each day. So here you see, what's going on, what is the range of variability. It's all over the place. And then here I have a little line going horizontally across. And the thickness of that line is the range of temperature change since 1800. Okay? So the most important thing to keep in mind is when people are arguing, is it warming? Is it cooling? Is it doing this? Is it doing that? We're talking about something tiny. And that is the crucial point. Now, there's a more subtle point of agreement between the first two narratives, and that is that catastrophism is unlikely. In point of fact, many of the foremost scientific supporters of alarm acknowledge the absence of a basis for alarm. So, for instance, here is an exchange from 2012 on BBC4 with Ralph Cicerone. Ralph Cicerone is president of the National Academy of Sciences and a very vocal supporter of climate policies of the government. So here is the interview. John Humphreys is the interviewer. Says, you don't sound, if I can use the word apocalyptic, I mean, you're not saying if we don't do these things, we're going to go to hell in a handbasket. We're going to fry in a few years. And Ralph answers coyly, well, there are people who are saying those things, John. But Humphreys presses on, but not you. And then Ralph responds, no, I don't think it's useful. I don't think it gets us anywhere. And we don't have that kind of evidence. Now, another person is Mike Hulme. He's director of the Tyndall Center at the University of East Anglia, which is a center of concern for global warming. Quoting him, to state that climate change will be catastrophic hides a cascade of value-laden assumptions which do not emerge from empirical or theoretical science. Even Gavin Schmidt, Jim Hansen's successor as head of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, whose website, realclimate.org, is a major defender of global warming, does not agree with claims of extremes. Quoting him, general statements about extremes are almost nowhere to be found in the literature, but seem to abound in the popular media. It's this popular perception that global warming means all extremes have to increase all the time, even though if anyone thinks about that for 10 seconds, they realize that's nonsense. Now, I should add that extremes depend significantly on the temperature difference between the tropics and the poles, something that is expected to diminish in a warmer world. This is an example of where alarmist claims actually contradict the basic physics. And this is known by the people supporting the issue. The first narrative holds, and this is where it becomes supportive of alarm, it holds that we don't know climate sensitivity and that this ignorance allows for the possibility of a serious problem. Possibility. This is the role of the narrative one, to preserve a possibility. The preservation of uncertainty is the crucial tool for the first narrative's implicit support for alarm, and explains why the IPCC range of possible sensitivity has not changed since the Charney Report of 1979. By climate sensitivity, I simply mean the amount of warming expected from each doubling of CO2. Now, here are some remarks from the presidents of the Royal Society, Martin Rees, and of the National Academy, Ralph Cicerone. They were published in the Financial Times, I think 2013. They wrote a letter and they said, straightforward physics tells us that this rise is warming the planet. Calculations demonstrate that this effect is very likely responsible for the gradual warming observed over the past 30 years, and that global temperatures will continue to rise, superimposing a warming on all the other effects that make climate fluctuate. And then, almost as a parenthetical remark, they add, uncertainties in the future rate of this rise, stemming largely from the feedback effects in water vapor and clouds, are topics of current research. How many of you would guess that it's the so-called uncertainties that are in fact the main issue? The straightforward physics is trivial and generally accepted and not alarming. They continue, our academies will provide the scientific backdrop for the political and business leaders who must create effective policies to steer the world toward a low-carbon economy. Despite the uncertainty, they're saying, the policy is determined. There are numerous examples of the issuance of unalarming claims that are interpreted as demanding immediate action. Perhaps the most striking example involves the iconic statement of the IPCC. Most of the warming over the past 50 years is due to man. Now, people, get excited over this. Is this statement alarming? No. I mean, this statement is saying we're speaking about small changes. A quarter of a degree centigrade would be about 51% of recent warming. And that strongly suggests low and inconsequential climate sensitivity, meaning no problem at all. If I can get back. Now, here's something, and I wish all of you would do this, because I think some of our earlier talks are misleading on this. This is a graph of temperature change. It's from the Hadley Center since 1850. And, we'll discuss up and down, and these are peaks, and this is warmer, and so on. What I urge you to do when looking at a graph, check the scales. The pink fuzz is an estimate of the uncertainty. The uncertainty on here is tenths of a degree. When somebody points to this and say this is the warmest temperature on record because it's warmer than this, what are they talking about? What is anyone talking about when they even criticize this? It's just nonsense. This is a very tiny change, period. And arguing about hundredths of a degree when your uncertainty is tenths of a degree. And the proof that the uncertainty is tenths of a degree are the adjustments that are being made. If you can adjust it 2/10 of a degree, it means it wasn't certain to 2/10 of a degree. And adjustments are made to all this data, including the satellite data. Okay, now, when it comes to political figures, and we come to narrative 3, then we're transcending the absurd. So, for instance, we just went over the IPCC iconic statement. Here is how Senators McCain and Lieberman responded to it. The recent report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change concluded there is a greater than 90% chance that greenhouse gases released by human activities like burning oil in cars and coal and power plants are causing most of the observed global warming. And they conclude this report puts the final nail in denial's coffin about the problem of global warming. Now, it should be noted that the IPCC wisely avoided making the claim that 51% of a small change in temperature constituted a problem. This they left to the politicians and to anyone who took the bait. Okay. Now, when you come to skeptics, and I've spent very little time on our position, here are some typical differences between skeptics and the first narrative. For instance, skeptics might agree that alpine glaciers have been retreating since the early 19th century or earlier, but they're also aware that alpine glaciers were largely absent during the medieval warm period, and that their more recent retreat was preceded by well over a century, the period when anthropogenic greenhouse warming became moderately significant. As you saw in this morning, and you'll see from Patrick, more generally, Skeptics are acutely aware of the Earth's climate history and know that warmth and high CO2 are common to this history. Skeptics generally regard the fact that virtually all models run hot, as say their projections for the period 79 to the present, for the most part greatly exceed observed warming, strongly supporting low climate sensitivity. Skeptics generally believe in testing the physics underlying the positive feedbacks in sensitive models rather than averaging models. The results point to low sensitivity. Skeptics also are much more open to the numerous known causes of climate change, including long-period ocean circulation, solar variability, and the various impacts of ice, and do not regard CO2 as the climate's ultimate control knob. Of course, the third narrative dominates public image, but it originates almost entirely from the political and environmental communities and not from the scientists who actually consider the physics of climate. Here's President Obama's constant refrain. Climate change is contributing to extreme weather, wildfires, and drought, and that rising temperatures can lead to more smog and more allergens in the air we breathe, meaning more kids are exposed to the triggers that can cause asthma attacks. Pope Francis, President Hollande, and virtually all state leaders have chimed in with similar proclamations. Kerry almost stands alone, though, in the idiocy of his remarks. I don't have time to quote them all, but here's the one where he feels this is right up there with terrorism. Here it's compelling us to act. There is no doubt in anybody's mind. The science is absolutely certain, thus expresses his ignorance of what science is. I know sometimes I can remember from when I was in high school and college, some aspects of science or physics can be tough, chemistry. But this is not tough. This is simple. Kids at the earliest age can understand this. It's the only reason he thinks he can, I suppose. First and foremost, we should not allow a tiny minority of shoddy scientists and science and extreme ideologues to compete with scientific fact. This is not an opinion. This is about facts. This is about science. The science is unequivocal. And those who refuse to believe it are simply burying their heads in the sand. Now, President Obama and I believe very deeply we do not have time for a meeting anywhere of the Flat Earth Society. Okay, and then you have Gina McCarthy, head of the EPA. I don't want to be too snobbish, but UMass Boston is not a very good school. And a background in anthropology from UMass Boston. That's, our main campus is Amherst. And a Master of Science in Environmental Health Engineering and Planning Policy is not exactly making you an expert in climate. But to quote her, by now we all know that climate change is driven in large part by carbon pollution, and it leads to more extreme heat, cold, storms, fires, and floods, all of which has been denied by the scientists, not even the skeptical scientists. We are way past any further discussion or debate. Scientists are as sure that humans are causing climate change as they are that cigarette smoke causes lung cancer. So unless you want to debate that point, don't debate about climate change any longer, because it's our moral responsibility to act. That responsibility right now is crystal clear, and that is why we have taken action. The science has spoken on this. A low-carbon future is inevitable. We're sending exactly the right signals on what at least EPA believes to be a future of lower pollution that is essential for public health and the environment, that EPA is not just authorized but responsible to acknowledge and push towards. Okay, now these people are pretending to speak for science, but I actually find Christiana Figueres, the executive secretary of the UN's Framework Convention, to be more honest. This is the first time in the history of mankind that we are setting ourselves the task of intentionally, within a defined period of time, to change the economic development model that has been reigning for at least 150 years since the Industrial Revolution. Ms. Figueres is not alone Pope Francis' closest advisor castigated conservative climate change skeptics in the United States, blaming capitalism for their views. Speaking with journalist Cardinal Maradiaga, criticized certain movements in the United States, presumably you, that have preemptively come out in opposition to Francis' planned encyclical on climate change. The ideology surrounding environmental issues is too tied to a capitalism that doesn't want to stop ruining the environment because they don't want to give up their profits. Okay, nevertheless, the government's monopoly over science support, as well as generosity of the support for climate, it's inevitable that parts of the scientific community will cooperate. Now, such support is automatic for working groups 2 and 3 of the IPCC. They deal with impacts and mitigation, and they start with worst-case scenarios from working group 1, and are therefore automatically alarmist. The issue of impacts is an open invitation to one and all to feed at the government's gravy train. The website, and here I give you a website, lists some of these impacts ranging from acne to walrus stampedes to typhoid fever. My puzzlement was I couldn't find asthma on this list. There's also a lot of science on demand. So, for instance, you have a well-established medieval warm period. It's a problem for the narrative. Michael Mann's hockey stick gets rid of it. You have the physics of moist convection requires warming maximized in the upper troposphere. It should be tropical troposphere. And models agree, but the data doesn't show this. Ben Santa reworks the data to show the maximum. Significant warming ended about 18 years ago, showing CO2 is not a major factor in climate. Tommy Carl adjusts and rearranged the data to eliminate the pause. Now, what's the crucial thing about it? The examples of science on demand are amusing, but seldom actually deal with alarm. They are part of the bait-and-switch property of many of the disputed results, which are held to support alarm even when they don't. For example, Carl's adjusted data still shows the models are running hot. There's no need to get rid of his data. It doesn't show anything different. But if you're going to argue, is it warming or cooling, and you don't care about 1/100th of a degree, then it makes a difference. Okay, here's some advice, and I'll leave it with that. Don't take the bait. Learn how to identify claims that have no alarming implications and feel free to say, so what? Alarm, moreover, inevitably involves questions of how much. A little is not the same as a lot. Focus on the alarming claims that are imaginary claims that are without any basis. And there are plenty of those that have no foundation in the science at all. By contrast, the claims of beneficial impacts of CO2 and even warming are in fact well documented. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for inviting me. Should we celebrate CO2? By the end of this, you'll clap even louder for that proposition, I hope. Let me just, Dick, you talked about uncertainties. I'm going to tell you a couple of certainties. There is no definitive scientific proof that the slight warming that has occurred over the last 300 years since the end of the Little Ice Age, or the peak of the Little Ice Age, has anything to do with CO2. It may well, but there's no proof that it does. All that we have is the hypothesis that seeing as though CO2 is a greenhouse gas, increases of it in the environment, all else being equal, should cause some warming. How much we don't know. But all else is seldom equal. So if things were unequal, it may not cause any at all, or in fact go the opposite direction. However, we know for absolute certain that CO2 is the stuff of life, the foundation of the existence of life on Earth, and that it is at one of the lowest points in the history of the life on Earth during the present era, and that more of it would be beneficial for life on Earth. Those are certainties. Let me give you a little background on myself, really short bit. I'm no city kid. I grew up on this floating logging camp on the north end of Vancouver Island in the rainforest on the Pacific Ocean, and lived in that little house for 14 years till I was sent off to boarding school, where I ended up at the University of British Columbia studying the life sciences, enrolled in a PhD in ecology before that word was known to the general public in the late 60s, and ended up joining a little group after being radicalized like this. Can't seem to get it to go that way anymore, but it was the hippie era, and I found myself joining a little group in a church basement in Vancouver to send a boat upon which I sailed across the North Pacific to protest U.S. hydrogen bomb testing in Alaska. That was the last hydrogen bomb the United States ever detonated. President Nixon canceled the rest, and the Cold War began to end. This is us founding Greenpeace in 1971. We went out and harassed the Russian whalers, putting ourselves in front of the harpoons to save the whales. We stopped the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of baby seals every year off the east coast of Canada. Why did I leave Greenpeace after 15 years? When we began, we had a strong humanitarian orientation to save the world from nuclear war and civilization from nuclear war. That was the peace in Greenpeace. As time went on, the peace got left behind, and all there was left was the green. And by the time I left 15 years later, as one of 6 international directors, Greenpeace and the rest of the movement was talking about the human species as the enemy of the earth, the enemy of nature. That's hardly a humanitarian thought. I believe in a humanitarian environmentalism where humans are taken into consideration along with the other species on the planet, where sustainability, which I don't think is a dirty word, it's bandied about so much by both sides, it's really hard to come down with a meaningful definition of it, but what it really means is balancing these social, economic, and environmental priorities and trying to come up with win-win-win situations that help the environment and human beings at the same time. And there's plenty of good examples of that. Anyways, I could go on for a long time about why I left Greenpeace, but I did, and now I'm the sensible environmentalist, and climate has been one of my key areas of study for the last 25 years. This is the Keeling curve of increasing CO2, the smoking gun of catastrophic human-caused climate change. And this is the kind of headlines it generates. As Dick was pointing out, there is actually no reason for alarmism given the actual facts of what has happened with the climate to date that we know of, that we've measured, that we experienced. But this is what you get. Point of no return, nightmares are here, climate catastrophe is with us now. And that's what we're up against. They make stuff up. There's another word that starts with S, that, which I only say in polite company, but or don't. But that's what they do. They make stuff up. And that's what we're dealing with, is pure political propaganda that has nothing to do with science. Here's some science. I'll use the stick. This is another version of the curve of carbon dioxide in purple and temperature in blue. Do you see a high correlation between these two? From 570 million years ago here, this is the first 4 billion years of the Earth. We'll forget about that. This is the last 570. Since the Cambrian explosion, when life blew up into all kinds of species on the planet and modern life emerged, and life went on the land right around here. And right around here was the first time that CO2 fell down to really low levels. Almost as low as today, or perhaps as low as today. There's only been 2 times in the history of life when that's happened. Then, 290 million years ago, and now. This is the most interesting thing about it. But before I go on, I'll just say there's been many times, like here, where CO2 and temperature were completely out of whack. Here, and here, and here, and here, as it's been going down for 100 million years, CO2 temperatures reached the highest it's been in the history of modern life. This is not a cause-effect relationship. There is almost no correlation, and cause-effect requires tight correlation, not just some correlation. This is not a cause-effect relationship. So, we end up all talking about the same stuff because it's one subject, this issue of CO2 and climate and temperature. But I'm going to hopefully give you a couple of things you didn't know about before. This here is the first time CO2 came down 90% from 4,000 parts per million to 400 parts per million. Why? Because this is when forests emerged on the land. And suddenly, with the advent of wood evolving, plants could grow up 300 feet more high to get their leaves in the sun, and the biomass of planet Earth grew by orders of magnitude. Because before that, all there was stuff on the ground, little wee things this big. And then trees came. But when the trees came, there was no decomposer species that could digest lignin, which is what made wood possible, lignin surrounding cellulose. Cellulose had been around for billions of years, but lignin had not. Lignin's really hard to decompose. That's one of the reasons we have trouble making biofuels out of wood, because it's really hard to degrade wood. It's easy with sugar and starch and oil, but with wood, very tough to break it down. And there was no decomposer species on planet Earth that could eat wood. So for 90 million years, the carbon just kept getting pulled down into new trees as they fell on top of the dead ones. Trees died, fell down, new trees grew on top of them, and 100 meters thick or more. That's what created the huge beds of coal that are all around the world on all the continents, was the fact that nothing could digest the wood. So CO2 was drawn down by life itself. The stuff of life was diminished by 90% by life itself. In other words, a self-defeating procedure in the end, if it weren't for a fungal species. This one, Trametes. You've all seen it in the woods on dead trees. This species of fungus learned to make the enzymes that digest lignin. And that is when coal formation ended. We know this is perfectly in sync. This species developed lignin digesting enzymes, coal formation ended. Coal isn't being made anymore. Oil and gas are, because they're made in the bottom of the sea on the continental shelves by the raining down of plankton and the organic parts of those species. But this ended coal formation and saved life from extinction, because if they hadn't evolved, this line would have just kept going down until it got to 150 parts per million, where the trees and the plants would start to die of starvation for lack of CO2. But the fungus, miraculously, because there was no preordained factor that that enzyme would be evolved in anything, but it was in a fungus. This is the last 65 million years of life, temperature. This is from Hansen, James Hansen, the former head of the GISS, and he did this in 2008. So he knows that it was way hotter 50 million years ago than it is now, and that we've actually been in a 50 million year cooling period to date. It's colder now, on average, in this Pleistocene ice age for the last 2.5 million years than it has been in almost the whole history of life. People think the ice age ended when the last glaciation receded. That was 1 in 20 or 60 glaciations that have occurred since the Pleistocene ice age began 2.5 million years ago, right here. That's when it started. This is when Northern Hemisphere glaciation began. This is when Antarctic glaciation began. Before that, the Earth was ice-free going back to the previous ice age, which was 150, 250, I forget, millions of years ago before that. So we've been in a 50 million year cooling period, and we're in one of the coolest periods. That's why there's ice all over the poles. That's why Canada is a solid white sheet for 6 months of the year, the whole continent up there where I come from. Why are there 300 million people in the United States and only 30 million people in Canada, which is larger in size? One word: cold. And that is a fact. There's no other reason. The Milankovitch cycle. Everybody should know about the Milankovitch cycle, of course, but most people think history only goes back to when their first memories were as a child. These are 100,000 year cycles. They have to do with the orbit of the Earth, the eccentricity of the orbit of the Earth around the sun, the obliquity or tilt of the Earth, which wobbles around like this with time, and these peaks are the interglacial periods. These bottoms are the height of the glaciations. So here is the last one here. This is the last interglacial period before ours. This is an 80,000 year period going down into the peak of the Ice Age. And this is coming out, always coming out fast. Here, come out fast for 10,000 years. And then there's a 10,000 year approximately interglacial period, but they range quite a bit. And we're about 10, 12,000 years into our interglacial period. So the next 80,000 year long downward trend into another glaciation should occur sometime in the next 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years. So that's that. But that cycle is very clear. Just want to establish that. This is what we've done. That's the CO2. It's now 400. This is from, 4 years ago. But that's what we've done. So will that make a difference? Unfortunately, it does not appear to be so. Because this pause that's gone on for nearly 19 years now, we put 1/3 of all our CO2 into the atmosphere during this pause. 1/3 of all human emissions of CO2 because of the exponential curve, China, India, and all. Now, if 1/3 of all human emissions does not make any warming in a nearly 20-year period, how can we be sure that CO2 is going to cause any warming at all? And I'd rather we could be sure that it would, because it might jumpstart us out of the next slide down if we did. So there's no guarantee of that. But at least if it does go down, there'll be enough CO2 to grow food faster in the areas that are still not covered in a sheet of ice. This is 50,000 years. So this is well into the last glaciation. It was cold. And then 18,000 years ago, we started coming out of it. This shows that, as has been pointed out, temperature starts to go up ahead of CO2. It's about an 800-year average lag time, so there's no way that CO2 causes temperature. It is possible, however, that temperature causes CO2. How? Because when the Earth's heat changes, it warms the oceans if it's warming, and warmer water holds less gas, so it makes sense for CO2 to come out when the ocean's warm, because the oceans contain 40 times as much CO2 as the atmosphere. So a little bit of CO2 coming out of the oceans makes a big difference to the atmosphere. When the oceans cool, they absorb CO2, which makes sense, and that's why they follow each other through the Vostok ice cores, which is, sorry, that's what that is, the Vostok ice cores. And so is this. This is where the ice sheet was 20,000 years ago. Montreal had 3.3 kilometers of ice over top of it. There's 3.5 million people there today. That's not very long ago. Boston had over a kilometer. Chicago had nearly a kilometer of ice on top of it. And Toronto had over 2 kilometers of ice on it. And that line went all the way across Europe and all the way across Russia. The whole of the northern hemisphere, halfway down practically to the equator, was covered in a sheet of ice. And that is what might happen regardless of what we do. Hopefully the CO2 will do something to offset the next glaciation. James Lovelock hopes so too. This is the longest thermometer record continuous we have in central England, going back to 1659. It shows a nice, steady, with all the noise, of course, as has been pointed out. It's never a flat line, but it's a pretty straight, even line with perhaps a little exaggeration at the end here. This is only to 2009, so that would have flattened out to here by now. Here's the CO2, human emissions of CO2. Do those two curves look like they are tightly correlated? This is the truth. These are real observations that have been made by human beings, as opposed to computer models. And yet we're told that temperature and CO2 are inextricably cause-effect relationship. And again, there's the 18 years, that's only it's 2 months longer since this graph got put here, but there's the curve of the CO2 in relation to the flat temperature line. CO2 is the most important food for all life on Earth. This is a certainty, as is water, one of the most important things for life on Earth, as is sunlight. Put sunlight, water, CO2, and a smattering of minerals from the soil and some nitrogen from the air that goes via the soil into the roots, and you have the composition of life. But CO2 is in many ways the most important one today. You've seen this many times. Please look at it again. You can't see this too often. This is also a certainty that the greening of the Earth is occurring and that CO2 is, well, certainly the main reason that it is. The only other factor could be temperature, and temperature hasn't moved much. Not enough to explain a 30% increase in growth of vegetation across the Sahel. How good is this for the people who live here in poverty? All the CO2 in the atmosphere was outgassed from volcanic activity, either on the surface or under the sea. This CO2 has provided the basis of life for 3.5 billion years on this Earth. If there was no CO2 in the atmosphere of the Earth, actually, if there wasn't a certain level, about 140 to 50 ppm, this would be a dead planet like Mars. There would be no life on this Earth, if not for the CO2 that came out from the volcanoes. Where is the carbon? 850 billion tons of it. They call it petagrams, but I think billion tons sounds more comprehensible. 850 billion tons is in the atmosphere today. Plants and soils among them have nearly 3 times as much carbon as is in the global atmosphere. The ocean has nearly 40 times, sorry, more than 40 times, nearly 50 times as much carbon in it as does the global atmosphere. Burning fossil fuels, this is a little dated, again, it's happening quickly. This is now 10 million tons of carbon as carbon dioxide going up from burning fossil fuels. People say this number is small compared to these numbers. The red are all annual flows. The blue is stocks, like how much is there as a quantity. But these are just cycled back and forth. This is a one-way addition to the existing carbon cycle. That's why when people say we're only 3% of the carbon going into the atmosphere every year. No, we're nearly 100% of the new carbon going into the atmosphere every year, because we are taking carbon from this reserve, which is not in the carbon cycle, was captured and sequestered hundreds of millions of years ago. The biggest capture sequestration in history, except for the next one I'll tell you about, second biggest. That carbon is going back into the atmosphere and causing that Keeling curve to go up like this. The Earth's crust has 100 million billion tons of carbon in it in the form of carbonaceous rocks. Limestone, dolomite, chalk, marble, calcium carbonate. All the carbon in calcium carbonate came from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This is about the second time, what I'm going to tell you now, that life has drawn down CO2 to the lowest levels in the history of life. The first time was the trees and wood. The second time is the fossil fuels. Sorry, not the fossil fuels. Yeah, well, it was the fossil fuels. Second time was the fossil fuels being sequestered over, continuing to be sequestered over time. Let's remember, fossil fuels are 100% organic, as in organic chemistry, the chemistry of carbon, hydrocarbons, produced with solar energy, and when burned, produce food for life. This is the largest storage battery of solar energy on Earth. Think of it that way. Running out of time, I'm almost finished. 100 million billion tons of carbon have been sequestered by coccolithophores, the most abundant phytoplankton, that is photosynthetic plankton in the sea. This is calcium carbonate shells. Shellfish, foraminifera. Those are animals. That's a calcium carbonate shell. By creating protective armor for themselves, these species of marine organisms have sucked 100 million billion tons of carbon out of the atmosphere over the centuries. Volcanism has slowed. Today, the US Geological Service says that volcanoes emit less than 1% of the CO2 that is going into the atmosphere. Most of it's from us. What would have happened? Sorry, here is the history of the world, and here is the general trend of CO2 in the atmosphere with ups and downs, but that's the trend. All during this time, from here, this is when shellfish evolved, calcium carbonate shells and corals and coccolithophores and foraminifera, sucking the CO2, the life-giving CO2, out of the atmosphere. And CO2 fell to 180 parts per million at the peak of the last glaciation, the lowest it has been in the history of the Earth, more than likely. And what would happen if humans had not started putting CO2 back into the atmosphere, finally countering the calcifying marine organisms which had been drawing it down for 150 million years? Here, 150 million years of CO2 steadily going down, with not enough CO2 coming from volcanoes anymore to offset it, so the net effect was a continuous downward trend. And this results in 1.75 million years, the death of plants for lack of CO2 if we hadn't come along. Just to conclude, we have bought already 40 million years more. If we stopped emitting carbon today, we have already put enough CO2 back in the atmosphere to last for another 40 million years. If we keep it up, we can keep life on this planet going just fine for the next 500 million years, especially seeing as though we know how to burn carbonaceous rocks to make cement. Calcium carbonate makes calcium oxide plus CO2. 5% of all human CO2 emissions are in the form of cement making by using limestone. So even if we stopped using fossil fuels altogether today, just the CO2 manufacturing would be more than enough to offset the loss of CO2 that was steadily occurring in the absence of human CO2 emissions. That is my thesis. Thank you very much. Oh, my last slide. Let's celebrate CO2. Hey, hey.
How many, that's what I thought. We're not going to have time for questions, which is regrettable because we don't want to make the next panel late. But
Split around here. I'm sorry I was so long. That was the shortest I can do.
but any questions you may have, please.
Just one quick one. Is there any textbook or anything out there that could be given to students that has any of this information in it?
What's the best book?
Any kind of textbook?
A textbook, no, but I think Climate Change, the Facts is pretty good.
Yeah, the non-governmental.
That's too long.
Okay, Climate Change, the Facts. Which one is that?
That's out of Australia. It has a lot of essays.
Yeah.
They're short. They're reasonably good. Climate Change, the Facts. And it's available on Amazon. It's reasonably priced.
But I was going to encourage those. Yes, all the presentations will be on the website. And but I encourage you all to ask your questions if during the reception and all of that. And I'm sorry we didn't have time, but I hope this was value added. Very complex subject matter, but very, very important. And thank you all so much.
Thanks. If anybody wants my slideshow, just email me. I've got a much longer presentation, so ask me for it.
Yeah.